So good morning, friends, and welcome to a very special event of the Chamberlain Interfaith Fellowship, which many of you know was established in the fall of 2015 through the vision and generosity of David and Sydney Feldman, members of Temple Bet Shalom, in the memory of their longtime friendship of David Feldman with Dr. Ted Chamberlain, who served for nearly 30 years here in student development at Eastern University. Dr. Chamberlain died unexpectedly in 2010. So now we are in our 6th year of a Jewish Christian interfaith learning and relationship building with students from each institution. Collectively, from both TBS and Eastern University, we've had 45 students impacted through this fellowship. We are grateful as a Christian institution to have this partnership. As many of us have observed, in these times of political and religious strife, the world needs the Chamberlain Interfaith Fellowship. And a very happy Passover to our Temple Bet Shalom friends, and a blessed Holy Week to our Eastern University friends. I'm very grateful that Dr. Alan Stern, who I got a chance to talk with last week, who's a pediatrician in the Needham, Massachusetts, and a member of Temple Bet Shalom's Board of Trustees, will lead us in an important presentation. And we are so grateful to have his father here. We're honored, sir, that you are with us this morning. And also Rabbi Jay, of course, being with us. We are honored that he is there present too. To make our time just a little bit more personable in Zoom, I'll ask Dr. Stern to introduce himself, and then those members from TBS, you can unmute yourself and just say hi. And then we'll do the same from Eastern University colleagues. And then lastly, we'll have our Chamberlain Interfaith Fellows just unmute yourself and say good morning and maybe your major and what year you're in. So Dr. Stern, welcome.
Well, thank you. Please call me Alan. I really appreciate this opportunity to speak with you this morning, and thank you so much for setting this up. It's a wonderful program, and I'm happy to support it with this talk and in other ways. I am a pediatrician in the town of Needham. I grew up in Needham. I live in Needham. I work in Needham. I didn't get very far in life, I guess, but here it is. I am the son of Sam Stern, who you also see on this Zoom call. And I am married to Lori, who may very well be joining us soon. I'm the father of 3 almost 23-year-olds, Reuben, Jeremy, and Celia. So thank you very much, and look forward to speaking with you.
If I may, I will jump in now because it's very easy. I am the father of the person who spoke last. That's it. We don't need any more. Please call me Sam.
Great. I'm Jay Perlman. It's a joy to be with you all.
Ron Matthews. Please call me Ron. In my role, I'm sure I've been called many other things. Welcome.
Jackie Irving. Nice to meet everyone.
I'm Heather Norsini, and I'm so grateful to be here, and I can't wait to hear what Sam has to say and Alan has to say and learn from you all.
Taylor, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself and then our students.
Sure. I am Taylor Gray, the Administrative Assistant for the Office of Faith and Practice, and I am grateful to be here and hear what you're going to talk about.
I can go first. So, hi everyone, I am Kate Casey. You can call me Kate. I am a sophomore double major in social work and biblical studies here at Eastern University.
Hello everyone, my name is Ryan Casper. I'm a junior at Eastern University, and I am major in biblical studies.
Hi, my name is Mary. I'm a junior here at Eastern University, and my major is special education.
Hi everyone, I'm Andrew. I'm a junior psychology major with a minor in Spanish.
Great. Well, if I could just ask if everyone could mute themselves. I'll be sharing my screen and giving a presentation and have some time at the end for questions. So if you can write those questions down and save them for the end, that would be wonderful. So I'm going to share my screen. Can everyone see this? Just give me a thumbs up. All right, great. Thank you. So I understand from Joe that you just recently read Night by Elie Wiesel. And we can talk a little bit more about this, but to start things off, I want to say that I'm so pleased to be here, to be with you, to tell you about this story of survival, of luck, and of hope, and above all, a story of freedom. And it seems to be rather appropriate that we're talking about this during Passover. So this quote by Elie Wiesel, which I've grown to love, is from the preface of one of his novels, The Gates of the Forest. God made humans because God loves stories. It's a bit of a paraphrase from the quote, but gets the point across. I will call this simply a stern story. My birth certificate says that I was born on September 11th, 1964, but I would like to posit that the notion of me came about on April 15th, 1945. To start this story off, just show you some maps. You'll see throughout this presentation that I do love maps, but I'd like to orient you to Germany, where my father's family is from. And just to start off, in the north we have Denmark, and on the western side of Germany we have the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, and France. To the south we have Switzerland and Austria, and then to the east we have the Czech Republic and Poland. I want to draw your attention to two areas in Germany. One, this red circle here, is Nuremberg, where my father's family is from primarily. And there are two towns here, Fürth, where my father was born in 1939, and they also lived in Erlangen, which is another town close to Nuremberg. There's also this city, Frankfurt, which you've probably heard of, and my grandfather is from a small town near there called Niederhochstadt. This is a postcard of a drawing from the beautiful city of Nuremberg. Albrecht Dürer is a famous artist who's from Nuremberg. It's in this area of Germany known as Bavaria, really a quaint city. You've probably also heard of Nuremberg because of the Nuremberg laws, which were enacted in 1935. Jews in Nuremberg were forced to live in Jew houses, and it wasn't a good life. I can tell you that in Germany, all told, there were roughly 550,000 Jews from the period of 1933 to 1939. In Nuremberg itself, there were roughly 1,800 Jews that lived there. I just threw this quote in because even though this is a story of survival, luck, and hope, we have to remember that there was a lot of evil around. I just read this book by Alice Hoffman, The World That We Know. If you do not believe in evil, you are doomed to live in a world you will never understand. As part of these Nuremberg laws, Jews were forced to wear Jewish stars. This is a yellow star that we actually have in our possession. It's probably not from Germany. It might very well have been from the Czech Republic. But each country had these yellow stars where Jews were forced to wear them on their body. This is a picture of my great-grandparents, picture which I absolutely love. These are the parents of my grandmother, my father's mother. This is on their wedding day in the early 1900s, Frida and Joseph. I love it because even though they don't have a huge smile, you can tell that they're smiling, you can tell that they're looking forward. This is a picture of my immediate family. I can show you my biological grandfather, Arthur, who was born in Niederhochstadt near Frankfurt. My grandmother, Carolina, or Lena, who was born in Dormitz, a town just outside of Nuremberg. Just on the lower right here, this is Peter, my uncle, who was born in 1936 in Nuremberg. And this is my father, Sam, who was born in 1939 in Fürth. Arthur, by the way, was a wonderful auto mechanic and engineer. And he had a shop in Nuremberg and did a fabulous job. And the Germans actually knew how good he was and actually used him for his services because he was a phenomenal mechanic. I draw your attention to this card here for a couple of reasons. One, to show you how detailed the Germans were in keeping records. And to point out a few other things. First, if you can see these dates here, just to remind people that in Europe, the dates are reversed from how we use them in America. So you can see this first date here. This is the 29th day of August in 1907. That's the birth date of my grandfather, Arthur Israel Stern, my grandmother, Lena Sarah Stern. Here's Peter Israel Stern. We have Samuel Stern, and then Martin Israel Johlfelder. So a couple of things here. You notice that why do three of these individuals have the middle name of Israel? Well, in 1938, probably part of these Nuremberg laws, any Jew was forced to take the middle name of Israel for a man and Sarah for a woman. If you were born after August of 1938, which my father was in January of 1939, he did not have to take a middle name of Israel, but he had to have the name of Samuel. Again, another sort of map, and there are a few things that I'd like to point out to you here. This is the German machine of different concentration camps and death camps. There are a couple of things that I'd like you to look at. One, the dates. If you see Dachau down here near Munich, this actually came about in 1933, well before the war, which started in 1939. And some of these camps were still being built up until 1942. And there's a very famous conference, the Wannsee Conference, which took place in early 1942 to really solve the Jewish problem. So many of these camps came about after that, but many of them came about well before. You've probably heard of many of these camps, in particular Auschwitz, known as a death camp. But it's really important to understand that many people died in all of these camps, not just the death camps. I also want to point out in the lower right here, there's a map of Germany and Greater Germany. So you can see how Germany basically doubled or tripled in size as they pushed eastward during World War II. Some of these camps, though, are even off the map, and that'll get us to our next part of this story. The Jews of Nuremberg were forced out on one of the transports to a city in Latvia called Riga. There are roughly 5 different transports that the Germans enacted in the end of 1941, specifically November 29th, 1941. This is a list of almost a little over 500 Jews from Nuremberg who were forced to go to Riga by train, and people had to actually pay their way. They actually had to buy train tickets in order to be transported to a concentration camp in Riga. You can see here there are 3 stern names, Carolina, Peter, and Samuel. We're not actually sure if Arthur was on this transport or not. So in this transport, out of those 1,800 Jews, roughly 500 were transported to Riga. Riga is one of the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. And you can see this green portion here. This was constantly going back and forth between the Soviet Union and Germany, probably over centuries. But in particular during World War II, the Germans would push eastward, the Soviets would push westward. This constantly changed, but at the end of 1941, the Germans actually had all these this area here. And Riga, as you can see, sorry about that, you can see is part of Latvia up here. From Nuremberg to Riga is roughly 1,000 miles. Took probably a few days by train to get there. Here's a little bit of a blow-up of that area. You can see Riga kind of in the middle of these Baltic states here. There's a picture of the Skorotka train station where the family eventually arrived, probably early December. Could have been late November. Very cold. Many of the winters during that time period were extremely, extremely cold. When the family arrived, they were forced to walk roughly 3 miles to a concentration camp, which is not very well known, called the Jungfernhof concentration camp, just outside the city limits of Riga, where they eventually stayed for several months before being forced back to the Riga ghetto. This is just a map of the Riga ghetto. Just wanted to point out a few things. If you see in the upper right-hand corner, there's a legend. This is roughly a little more than 1/10 of a mile, which that represents. So you can see that all told, this was a 1/4 of a mile by 1/10 of a mile. So a real concentration that Jews were forced to live in this ghetto within Riga. And there are plenty of other ghettos throughout Europe and the Soviet Union. Do you want to say a few things about this time period? The family, Arthur, Lena, Peter, and Sam, were in Riga for roughly a 2-year period. They did spend some time being forced out of Riga into the very western part of the Soviet Union, a town called Pskov, for a very short time period. But they went back and forth between the concentration camp, the ghetto. They spent some time in officers' barracks in Germany. In Riga, but German officers' barracks. And lived their life, which was a complicated life. And you can imagine being a child growing up in a ghetto-like area, seeing death all around you. My father and Peter, as young children, remember they were 3, 4 to 6 years old at this time period, in 1942, they were forced to actually take the clothes from people who were being liquidated and store these clothes and put these clothes in piles. And you can imagine as a young child how that might affect you. There was a time period where the family was actually forced into a Riga jail, where they spent roughly 6 to 8 weeks in this one jail cell. That was towards the end of their time in Riga. And at that point, the family was actually put on trial. They were put on trial by a German judge, and I don't know if you could call it a court, but the family was given a choice. Arthur and Lena were told that they could give up their children, Peter and Sam, so that Peter and Sam could be Aryanized and placed into a German family. That way, Arthur and Lena could potentially stay together during this experience. Arthur and Lena refused to keep the family together, and the family was then sentenced to death. What happened after that, we don't know for sure, but we do know at that point the family was forced to be separated. Arthur was then forced to go to a camp in Germany called Buchenwald, and Lena, Peter, and Sam were then transported to a camp called Ravensbrück. So you can see that up here, Riga, the family was then transported to this area just north of Berlin to another concentration camp called Ravensbrück. Now, Ravensbrück was known as a women's camp. It was built near a camp called Sachsenhausen, just also north of Berlin. There were not many children who were there in Ravensbrück. But the family was there from early 1944 to early 1945. So after this 2-year period of being in Riga, they're back in Germany. This is challenging to see, but I'd like to draw your eyes to the lower left-hand corner, roughly in this area. If you can see the numbers 27021, Stern, Lena, Sarah, with a birth date, and then just below that, 27022, Stern, Samuel, with the date January 4th, 1939, my father's birth date, and the word K-I-N-D, or Kind, or child, like kindergarten. These were numbers, similar to, I'm sure you're all familiar with tattoos that many people did have, but these were uniform numbers that were attached to the clothing of individuals who were imprisoned in Ravensbrück. We have this very number, so this was the number for my grandmother, Lena, for her uniform, 27021, which she amazingly kept throughout her ordeal. And thank goodness that she did keep that. So we have physical memories of their experience. Again, even though this was a women's camp, there were some real tough times. The women guards were really tough individuals, really tough individuals. There were appels or roll calls every single day, oftentimes more than one. And I wanted to read just a brief description of that from this book called Triumph of Wounded Souls by Bernice Lerner. And it's stories of 7 different Holocaust survivors. My dad's one of those 7. and his chapter is entitled From Chaos to Order. There's a description of the appel. Sam remembers that the camp routine began with Zell appel. All of the inmates were required to stand for hours to be counted, regardless of the weather. Afterwards, the children picked through garbage and scrounged for food. They tried to play pranks on the guards, bothered by their mothers, made quiet mischief, and fended for themselves. They knew when to be quiet and when to respond to orders like well-trained dogs. At the end of the day, they lined up with all the other inmates for, again, the interminable appel. They went to bed, but rarely slept. So while in Ravensbrück, the family received notification about the death of my grandfather, Arthur. Arthur was in Buchenwald, as you recall, and Arthur died on May 30th, 1944. And I want to point out to you how machine-like the German regime was, how organized they were to send a death certificate to the wife of Arthur, who happened to be in a different concentration camp. Again, more records. This is a card from Buchenwald. This describes Arthur on the right-hand side, describes his hair color, his eye color, the shape of his nose, where he came from in Riga, went to Buchenwald, and his wife who's in Ravensbrück. And he was known as a Jewish political prisoner. All of this documented by the Germans. Arthur probably died of typhus, which is a disease spread by lice. But he could have been killed by another prisoner. We don't know, but either way, he was murdered. The family, the rest of the family who was in Ravensbrück at the time, probably for close to a year, doing these appels day after day after day, then received orders that they were to get on a transport in early 1945. They were going to Bergen-Belsen, which is another camp within northern Germany. This was happening because the Germans were losing the war. The Soviets were pushing back from the Eastern Front. The Allied forces were pushing from the Western Front. And the Germans needed, or the Nazis needed to gather the Jews and push them back into Germany. So the camps on the periphery then became camps in the middle of the German state, and the family was forced to go to Bergen-Belsen. But there's an amazing story that happened where the family was told to get on a transport. And my uncle Peter had unfortunately been dealing with an infection. He had boils all over his body. When he was at Ravensbrück, he did go to the hospital there to be treated. One of these boils on his neck had to be opened and drained. And he has a large scar on his neck as a result of this. But he had this procedure performed soon before they were transported to Belsen. He had bandages on his neck. My grandmother, Lena, who was a fabulous mother and always looked after her children, wanted to make sure that Peter's bandages were intact. And this was right before they were to get on a transport in cattle cars to go from Ravensbrück to Belsen. She refused to get on that transport. Excuse me. She refused because she wanted to make sure that Peter's bandages were in shape. A woman soldier with a machine gun told her, "No, you need to get on the transport." And she refused. A male soldier said, "That's okay, we'll get them next time." They didn't get on that transport to Belsen. All of those individuals who got on that train were killed. The family stayed in Ravensbrück for a day, a few more days, a week, then eventually got on another transport to Belsen in early 1945. Belsen, as you can see, is just north of Hanover and just almost due west of Ravensbrück. The family stayed in Belsen for about 3 months. On April 15th, 1945, the family was liberated by the British Army. I'd like to show you 2 minutes of film from a frontline video. There are some awful images, so I would like to just warn you about that. It's a roughly 2 minutes of video. I'm going to stop sharing here and then reshare.
Neat and tidy orchards, well-stocked farms lined the wayside, and the British soldier did not fail to admire the place and its inhabitants, at least until he began to feel a smell. It came from a concentration camp, a waste ringed with barbed wire and overlooked by watchtowers. Coming in from the flowering countryside, in spite of the frightful smell, things didn't seem so bad at first. Children smiled through the barbed wire, and women laughed and waved their hands. But Belsen camp was vast, and inside was a different story. They had not eaten for 6 days, and every soldier's stock of food was called into use. Water, too, had been cut off, and so the water cart was the most important thing to arrive. Most of the people seemed to be listless beyond hope and astonishment. Hunger had probably affected them that way. We discovered that among this stench of disease and decay was something a bit worse than hunger. Moving vaguely on rickety skeleton legs, they were too ill to eat. How grateful they were for a kindly word or gesture. What misery to live amongst such unmentionable filth, with scarcely the strength to pick the lice which inevitably swarmed over them. They seemed accustomed to the smell and the horror. They had seen all there was to see.
So that's just 2 minutes of a 50-minute film that is on Frontline, which is a PBS show. A couple of things that I would love for you to get out of this. One, there was a line at the very beginning, to feel a smell. The smell, the odor was so noxious. The British soldiers were overcome by this odor that they experienced, a noisome type of smell. Even though the camp was liberated on April 15th, 1945, many inmates died afterwards just from disease and starvation. And unfortunately, not everyone who was liberated could be saved. I want to show you, why do I show you this? One, because I think the visual testimony is crucial. This is a quote by General Dwight David Eisenhower, who was the commander of the Allied forces. The things I saw beggar description, the visual evidence and the verbal testimony of starvation, cruelty, and bestiality were so overpowering. I made the visit deliberately in order to be in a position to give firsthand evidence of these things, if ever, in the future, there develops a tendency to charge these allegations to propaganda. I think Eisenhower had the foresight to deal with Holocaust deniers. The family stayed in Belsen, which was then known as a displaced person camp, for a few months until August 1945. This is a letter from July 1945 by one of the British officers, Sergeant Seegers. I want to draw your attention to the third or fourth paragraph. This letter was to a cousin of the family who lived in Atlanta, who eventually sponsored the family to come to the United States. I'm sorry to say that her husband, Arthur, has been killed by the Nazis in a concentration camp, but now she is bearing her burden with courage and finds consolation in her 2 boys, who are about the most charming kids one can find. They are kind, well-behaved, intelligent, good-looking, and at the same time, real boys. Their long stay in various concentration camps does not seem to have affected them adversely. Given a fair chance, both will make their way all right in life. It's a family of 3 now. From Belsen, they eventually go back to Nuremberg in the fall of 1945, or the end of the summer of 1945, and live in a Jewish community house on Wielandstrasse. Of the 1,800 Jewish individuals from Nuremberg in 1941, only 50 survived. This is Nuremberg in 1945, bombed out Nuremberg. So what kind of home did the family go back to? These are some of the survivors from Nuremberg. I want to point out a few things to you. One, my father in the lower left here, my Uncle Peter in the lower right, my grandmother Lena here, and this gentleman, David Schneebald, who would eventually marry Lena and become my step-grandfather, but really the only grandfather that I knew. He was a wonderful, wonderful man, very loving man. He survived the war. He lived in Nuremberg. At the start of the war, was forced to Poland, and then actually he was forced into the Russian army, which, believe it or not, he survived for 4 years as a minesweeper. I just love this picture of my dad when he was younger. There's an identification booklet of my father's. So this was done in December of 1945. A few things to point out to you. If you can look on the right side, you can sort of see the background. There looks like a jail cell with a gaunt individual. You can see that background. And then my father, who's 6 years old at this point, is labeled as a political prisoner. How can you be 6 years old and be labeled as a political prisoner? The family lived in Nuremberg for another year and possibly spent some time in a displaced person camp near Munich before heading northwest to Bremerhaven, which is just north of Hamburg on the coast, and boarded a ship the second week of January 1947 to head to New York. They boarded the Marine Marlin. They made it to Ellis Island on January 24th, 1947. I think what this points out to you is that there was a family of 4, became a family of 3, and then became a family of 4 again. And this family of 4 again in New York City with my step-grandfather, David. And you can see that everyone's smiling. So a couple of points about this story. It's obviously hard to condense a story like this into roughly half an hour. But I want to ask you a few things and leave you with a few things. You know, I'm trying to channel my inner Hamilton, the musical, you know, who lives, who dies, who tells your story? And what will your story be? What does it mean to be a child survivor? And what does it mean to be a child of a Holocaust survivor? You can imagine that being a child survivor is different than being an adult who goes through these very experiences. I can tell you that being a child of a survivor is at times a burden, at times it's an honor, but I do firmly believe it's a story that I need to continue to tell to anyone who will listen. ACEs are adverse childhood experiences, and this is a fairly new phenomenon or description, really just started in the late 1990s. But the thought is that more than 60% of individuals experience at least one type of adverse childhood experience. That could be physical abuse, emotional abuse, could be a childhood illness. It's rather remarkable. It's also remarkable to know that the more adverse childhood experiences that one has, the more physical issues one has and emotional issues that one has. Memory is a funny thing. My father and Peter, 3 years apart, experienced basically the same issues, but they have different memories of what happened to them, different times in their lives, even though they were just 3 years apart. I hope that I've conveyed to you that many times this was just luck that the family survived, but also there was a lot of hope that goes along with this story. Raoul Hilberg wrote a book in the early 1990s called Perpetrators, Victims, and Bystanders. And I hope that all of you understand in hearing this story, there are all 3 of these individuals. The perpetrators, certainly, the victims, certainly, but there are plenty of bystanders. There are plenty of Germans and other Europeans who watched this happen and didn't speak up. There are plenty of individuals who did, and I'd like to recognize that. There are many righteous individuals, but think about what could have happened if many other people spoke up. This is a tagline that the organization Facing History and Ourselves has. People make choices, choices make history. Understand that the choices that you make will affect the future. Think about silence and indifference, and think about being an upstander. Think about when you see something that isn't right, say something, prevent it from happening. And I want to leave you with the thought of, who are your heroes? My heroes, many in this story. My grandmother, who was an absolute mama bear in saving her children throughout this ordeal. My grandfather, whom I never knew, who was an auto mechanic, who at times probably helped the Germans, and maybe that led to the safety of his family. And certainly my father, who experienced these horrible events, but is here today to tell the stories. We started with a quote by Elie Wiesel. Seems fitting that we might end with one. The opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. And indifference to me is the epitome of evil. There's a Talmudic passage, to save a life is to save the world. And I sincerely hope that all of you will lead your lives with this in mind. So we have smiling brothers who from generation to generation have their story told. So I thank you for your time. I know that we are nearly out of time, so I don't know if anyone has any questions at all or comments, but I'm happy to entertain them.
Alan, I just want to say on behalf of Eastern University how grateful, honored, and broken we are to hear this story, and to thank you for the time that you've taken to prepare it, accumulate it, present it. And I think all of us just ache in our soul at the capacity that what we think are normal human beings, the evil that we're capable of, and for the mercy of survival, and for the opportunity to hear your story. And Sam, thank you for joining us to incarnate this story so significantly, and to even see you smiling, and to see how somehow good has come after such awful chapters in this story. It's humbling and edifying. So thank you very much.
I would just want to echo President Matthews' remarks. I think what impacted me so deeply, Alan, is when you talk about the bystanders, when you speak about those who may have been complicit, and particularly, and this is just because I'm a Christian, how oftentimes the state church, how Christians in many ways should have stood up for justice and righteousness. Some did, but by and large, I just feel an overwhelming burden of where were the Christians and how complicit they were in allowing the state and their religion to become so interwoven. And that's a lesson to be even learned in our current context, when religion gets too close to power, to government and so forth. But a very powerful, powerful presentation, and an honor to be there. I just want to recognize one of our colleagues, Dr. Lindy Backus, who joined us a little later. Welcome, Lindy. Let's be honest, it's probably, we all want to cry together. Maybe there aren't words of process. And I want to be sensitive to the time for students in their classes. So how might we want to end together today? what would be a good thing? I know we could probably spend another hour just processing our feelings, which would be appropriate. But maybe Rabbi Jay, would you have a word to give to us today, perhaps, as we close out our time? I don't want to hate to put you on the spot, but
I think that, so first of all, I'll offer my own personal thanks to Alan and to Sam for sharing their life story and helping us to learn from that story and to grow through that story. And also I wanna thank all of the students for coming to hear the story. Words can be shared, but it takes those who listen in order to carry forward the message, to embrace the message, and then to live the word, to enact the message in a meaningful way. We gather together, blessed to be with one another in the Zoom space to hear of an awful chapter in world history. And there are many awful chapters in world history. We know that our world is not without pain and suffering. And we are called by the best of our faith traditions to become, as Dr. Stern said, to become sacred heroes, to walk in the footsteps of the prophets and to step forward and fight for justice and righteousness, and to find allies, to find those with whom we share common cause and value, so that our voices come to define the society that we build with one another. So my humble prayer at this moment, as we gather in remembrance and recollection, is that the stories that Alan has shared, the stories that Sam has lived, that they come to inspire us, to move us, to teach us, to step forward when what is right is called for, when a word is called for, when an action is called for. May we grow into better human beings from having heard the stories that we have heard today.
amen and amen. Thank you, Rabbi Jay. Friends, God be with you. I'm going to dismiss you now, and thank you so much, Dr. Stern, Sam, and for our friends from Temple Bet Shalom, and God bless you all. Bye-bye for now.
Thank you. I wish you a blessed Easter.
Thank you.
Thank you.